Also, I mean, your camera angle is better, but I liked in the last one, I had a look. There in the background was a book for playing piano, I assume, and the book had a lamp on it that, from a quick glance, looked totally like a Selamantiata mushroom. And I was like, oh, that's fortuitous.
Oh my God, this book?
Yeah, man, it looks just like a mushroom. Hello everyone, welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Gesso, and as you might notice if you're watching the video, or you're obviously hearing it if you're listening on audio only, I am not in my office. I'm actually out in my backyard shooting this. It's a beautiful sunny day, and hope to sort of catch a little bit of that fresh sunshine energy for y'all. I'm actually sitting next to my first ever attempt at a vegetable garden, since I have quite a bit of extra staying at home time. Made sense to try to grow some food. So I'll show you that at the end. I'll show you, I'll put a little video in the outro for those of you who watch this on YouTube to check out what my little garden looks like as I'm slowly figuring it out for the first time ever, sort of like trying to, it's like the equivalent of me trying to survive in the Amazon with nothing but a machete and a how to not die in the jungle handbook, but so far things are growing, so that's all right. Getting into this episode, it's with Dr. Douglas Tataryn. So Dr. Tataryn has been on the show before, back many, many episodes ago. Actually, it was called A Crash Course in Emotional Intelligence, and he was talking about his bio-emotive framework. There's a really cool story around how Doug and I met, and how that sort of came about, how our work seemed to align somehow, my mushroom work and his bio-emotive work, in a way that really added to my understanding of what I was doing with psilocybin. But that's in the last the previous episode, or at least I'm pretty sure. Fast forward to last year, and some close people I'm in community with here, we're all going to one of his courses at a place called Maple, which is sort of a meta monastery out in, I can't remember now, maybe Vermont. Anyways, and then I think it was because Douglas was on the Emerge podcast with Daniel Thorsten, and that got my community interested, and then they found that I had done an interview with him, and then we found out that he was coming to Toronto, so a bunch of us went to his process, or his workshop on the Nadera process, which is a type of, I say, like active crying or something. Anyways, so after all of that, there was a lot more content. There was a lot more learning that I had gone through because of all of this, and I realize there's a lot of sound going on now, so I apologize about that. But that's what led Douglas and I to get onto another call with each other here, specifically not to go back into the bio-emotive stuff so much so, because that was, present in the first interview, but to go into this thing that he put out called the 4 pillars of transformation, or the 4 aspects of transformation, which sort of takes a bio-emotive lens to looking at the different aspects of transformation as it's sort of represented in integral theory. Now, none of that might mean anything to you. It could just be a bunch of vernacular, 4 aspects of transformation, bio-emotive and integral theory and all the rest. But ultimately, whether or not that you're familiar with that, or it just sounds like jargon at this point, don't worry about that. This podcast is very easy to follow, and I found it to be incredibly helpful in a way of understanding how much my emotional life and my emotional history contributes to my experience of reality. And obviously, whenever I say experience of reality, the thoughts of how it connects with psychedelics comes up. And that's a point I want to make here about this podcast, because initially when I started it, it was very much about like, I want to have awesome conversations with people about psychedelics, and other people can listen to them and they can experience the awesomeness. And meanwhile, I get to learn from these incredible people and everybody, you know, that was the initial sort of like idea. But then as it went along, more and more I came to wonder to myself, like, what is this for? You know, I started getting deeper and deeper into psychotherapy and trauma and all this other stuff, and it occurred to me that in many ways the podcast is a journey for myself. It's a journey in me, in my life, basically sense making, learning how to make sense of my world in a way that, you know, is heavily leveraged on examining myself. And the ways I show up in the world, and how the way the world shows up in me. And also to do so, recognizing that the psychedelic experience and what I went through in the psychedelic experience has been so impactful and so quintessential to how I see the world now, that it's really been about what does sense making look like with the psychedelic experience as an essential thing that we're trying to make sense out of and with insofar as life. So that's much of why my content goes into these different realms that do or do not have so explicitly to do with psychedelic, as I tend to mention at the beginning of each episode anyways. And Douglas's work really lands in that same camp, although it's not as explicitly psychedelic as you'll see. It's not really psychedelic at all, except that the experience of the Dara can be very intense. Yeah, so that's a preamble, you know. And pardon me, it went on for a little while, but that's the preamble. Let's see who Douglas Tataryn is all about. So, Dr. Tataryn received his PhD in clinical psychology in 1991 from the University of Arizona. He was research methodologist and statistician. Wow, I don't know how to say that word. Statistician for 20 years, and left his position as a professor at the University of Manitoba in 2001, faculties of medicine and nursing, to become a full-time clinician and performance coach. He is also a lifetime meditator of 45 plus years and the founder of the bio-emotive framework. He conducts seminars in it, so bio-emotive framework, integral theory, sports psychology, and the integration of psychology and spirituality, and recently becoming a popular guest of podcast platforms and radio networks, like this one here on Adventures Through the Mind. His bio-emotive team is creating online programs to teach healthy emotional processing for people around the world. And prior to COVID-19, Dr. Tataryn was beginning to travel internationally to host workshop intensives, which, although it's not international, that's how he ended up in Toronto. He's from Manitoba. He is presently working with advanced meditators and spiritual teachers, entrepreneurs, and professional athletes on removing emotional barriers to goals and helping them live a healthy and balanced life. He does his coaching work using his own version of integral theory and the 4 facets model of human transformation. 4 facets, 4 pillars, 4 aspects. I got the pillars and aspects wrong, but the 4 facets of human transformation, which is essentially what Douglas is on the show to talk about today. And we're going to jump into that right away. First off, huge thank you to my patrons on Patreon. Wow, time is weird, money's weird, economy's weird, things are crazy, and a lot of you are continuing to stick around and support, and some of you are continuing to stick around and support with quite a bit of money, especially the people whose names are listed here on the screen on YouTube or in the description to these comments, description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out. And some of you are jumping on board brand new. Some of you left, and I totally respect that. Thank you for taking care of yourself. And yeah, it's been really beautiful to be facing this economic uncertainty and to see that my patrons have stuck around and continue to, help support the show because they believe in what I'm doing and believe in me, I guess, and that feels really good. And money does not equate to happiness or acknowledgement by any means, but in this context, it is a way in which I can feel and be fueled by the support that the listening community and particularly the patron cross-section of my listening community Wow, I lost track of what I was saying. I could just feel their support, and it feels great. So thank you very much. If you're not a patron and you like the show and you want to become one, it's something that you can do right now. It's feasible economically. Please do so. Patreon.com/James W. Gesso. There are different tiers that come with different options. I suggest the $8 plus tier if you're into getting a bunch of like free content, and the $23 plus tier if you're interested in being one of the people whose names were just on the screen or listed in the description of this episode. So again, patreon.com/James W. Gesso. You could leave a PayPal donation as well, one time. That feels good. That works. Thank you very much. With that said, big thanks to Giovanni for the generous generous PayPal donation. I'll be on his podcast pretty soon, Elemental Awakening. That'll get posted on jameswgesso.com. And yeah, so links to PayPal, Patreon, always contained in the episode description. So thank you very, very much for supporting the show financially. I think that's enough preamble for you. Please enjoy this interview with Dr. Douglas Tataryn.
Well, why don't we jump in? Douglas Tataryn, welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind.
Wonderful to be here. Wonderful. And it was actually really nice to see you in Toronto and spend some time with you in person, James.
Yeah, that was an interesting sort of like long circle to come back to not only Toronto, us having met in Winnipeg. It was Winnipeg, right? Yeah, several years ago during my tour across, my first cross-Canada tour. But to come back and for it not to just be me at your workshop, but me and like 10 or 11 of my like members of my community and my partner, and we were like all there. I was like, hey Doug, hi, welcome to Toronto. These are all my friends.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really nice group of people out there. I almost envy you, the kind of community that you've got that are so into all of these leading edge practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely the gratitude does not slip for me. Yeah, so I appreciate you saying that and seeing that. So you've been on the show twice now. First time we talked about a lot of things. We talked about sort of the basis of the bio-emotive framework. We talked about cultural alexithymia, the difference between feelings and emotions, and we talked about I think we talked a little bit about accidental conditioned history, the 9 core feelings. There's a lot of content there.
Muscle tension and repression.
That's right.
Interference. Yeah.
That's right. And the different ways in which we sort of stop ourselves from feeling. We talked about the triune brain. These are things that I don't necessarily want to talk about again with you, because for the listeners, they can just jump into that podcast. Although at some point, a little quick refresh might be necessary to explain what we're talking about during the interview. But I want to move on, because there was one thing that I took away from your workshop that felt extremely valuable, and as a model, and one thing that was also, basically the massive sort of like working part of the whole workshop, which you only casually referenced at the end of the last one, which is the Nadera process. So I'd like to really look into this model that you presented for us, which is the 4 pillars of transformation, and get in a little bit deeper with what the Nadera process is. Sort of starting with the model for the 4 pillars of transformation, if you can start us off there.
Yeah, the 4 pillars model is something that I started working on, I think in 2010, and it was it was coming out of the general integral milieu. Ken Wilber hadn't actually come up with all 4 at that point, and I had actually been giving talks on the 4 pillars. So he talks about, basically this is about people who have been doing a lot of deep spiritual practice and having to deal with the anomalies of enlightened spiritual teachers doing really dumb things, like whether it's financial or sexual scandals or power moves. And it was like people trying to make sense of, but they're enlightened. How could they be doing that? And what started emerging was that there was a cleaning up process that didn't necessarily get done when you had an enlightenment experience, and that there was a growing up process. And so they would talk about particularly with Zen Buddhism, there was a lot of enlightened Zen masters who developmentally, from a Western perspective, were still sitting at, say, a very traditional level of consciousness. So for them, it was easy to go to war and fight the enemy because that's what traditional consciousness sees. So it was becoming clear that enlightenment wasn't the final state of human perfection, that kind of the mythology of enlightenment had been made us to believe. And so it was like, okay, besides waking up, or the enlightenment process, you have to grow up and you have to clean up. And that was sort of, they were sort of saying those three things at different times, at different places. And I did some work with that, and I decided there was a fourth factor. And that fourth factor actually ends up being very relevant to the shamanistic world, which is, I call it looking around. And there's a reason for that. And Ken Wilber and his company basically say showing up, so that you need to show up in the world with your enlightened, grown up, cleaned up consciousness. You need to come back. It's like basically the bodhisattva vow. Mm-hmm. Except from my point of view, that bodhisattva vow actually is part of the growing up phase. It shows up your need or willingness to try and help humanity shows up as you grow up. You kind of you see yourself so close to the world and all other beings that there's an intrinsic vision that emerges that wants to help other people. The quadrant of looking around, as I call it, is more about perceptual sensitivity. And it makes sense from a theoretical point of view that I'll talk about after I've reviewed those four facets. So should I spend a little bit of time on what it means for the enlightenment and the growing up?
Yeah, I think
parts?
it would make sense before stepping into the looking around, because I find that to be quite curious, and we'll relate that to psychedelics a little bit or later in the interview. But specifically going through these four pillars: the waking up, growing up, or waking up, cleaning up, growing up, looking around, sort of like one after another, starting with waking up.
Yeah. So the waking up process is really, so basically we step back and we look at the four pillars, they seem to encompass all the necessary transformations that a person has to go through to be a completely perfected being. I don't know if that's actually possible, but those are the dimensions that you want to be moving up on. And when I was first doing this model and I was advertising it, I would actually say things like, you can be high on any one of these facets and be mistaken for a spiritual person, right? Because if you're really high on growing up, you look a certain way and you act a certain way. If you're really high on being cleaned up, you also have a certain sort of superpower that shows up that's beyond most people's capacities. And the enlightenment, well, that's the clear one. So the enlightenment or the waking up factor is really about our sense of self. And it's the big one that Buddhism tends to really emphasize. So they talk about coming to see the true nature of self, or realizing Buddha nature. And what that process is about is a disidentification process. We tend to be identified with parts of our ego structure or our way of coping with the world that essentially cause our problems. So if you've known somebody who won't go out into the community unless their hair is perfect and they've got their makeup on, or they've got their clothes has to be perfect, you could say that they're identified with their physical look or their physical body. And for the most part, the general rule of thumb is the more things you're identified with, the more suffering you're going to have in your life. And so most of us, when we look at sort of our process of developing an ego structure, we start off identified with the physical body as a baby. It's our first challenge of who are we? It's differentiate from mom, because we've just been merged with mom. And so the first thing we learn is that these hands are not the same as my mom's hands, right? When I do this, it feels differently than if I bite her fingers. So there's this sense of I am my body that kids go through. And then they move into like the terrible twos, or that time when they start to discover that if they're emotional, they can start to like impact their parents, and they can have temper tantrums. And literally when they get angry, they are their anger. And that's all there is. They're raging. And when they're crying, they're crying. I don't know if you've ever been like at a playground when a kid hurts themselves and they're just wailing at the top of their lungs. They come running over to mommy or daddy. They get a big hug and they feel comforted and soothed. And then all of a sudden, bang, the crying's completely gone, and they're laughing, and they're identified with that new state, right? And the old thing is gone. And
yeah,
so
I know all about that,
expression.
Actually. as an uncle,
You've got yeah, that's cool. So that identification with emotions, they are their pain, and it's very, very real. Now, a few years later, especially as you're going into teenagehood, you're going to, or probably much younger, you're going to be told, stop having that tantrum, or you're not going to get dessert after, or I'm going to put you in your bed. And so suddenly you have to recognize that you are having an anger outburst, and you have to control your emotions. You can't be your emotions. And so we basically now move up and identify with our thoughts. And most people stop there. So we started off identified with our body. We left that. We identified with our emotions. And then we leave that and we're identified with our thoughts, and we can control our emotions and we can control our body. That's how you get kids to sit still in school when it's a very unnatural process. You get a very heavy cognitive overlay on that. And the fact that you are your thoughts is probably one of the biggest challenges for people sitting down to meditate. Because when they go to put their attention on their breath or the candle, their thoughts come up, and instead of taking them as objects, they get right into that. And they get, it's very real. They think whatever they're concerned about is very important, and they find themselves off in that particular little dream world. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it takes a while to pull your sense of self out of the thinking process and say, oh, those are thoughts. I want to put my attention here. And so you're learning to disidentify from your thought or your thinking process. You need to continue that process of not being your thoughts, not being your creativity, not being whatever's arising until, and this is what the Vipassana process is. Have you done Vipassana?
I have not. No. In my younger days, I was a little bit more likely to like push the boundaries, which ended up getting me hurt several times. But in that time frame, when I would have been most ripe to just like jump into a 10-day silent, Vipassana retreat, I didn't. Right. And since then, I have several resistance manifesting excuses, such as like responsibilities and work, and underneath all of that is fear. But no, I have not done a Vipassana.
Okay. So one of the stages that's fairly common, but it's fairly advanced, is that, and also I'll describe my experience of it, is that you get really quiet and your thoughts have stopped a while ago. So there is just this no thinking mind. And as a sidebar here, I really get upset when some teachers say, you're never going to stop thinking. It's just part of who you are. So just learn to ignore that. Well, they clearly haven't done deep meditation, because when you've gone into deeper states of meditation, the thinking process does stop. And so there's something there that can literally begin to see the internal landscape. Just like I can see cell phones, like I recognize this as a cell phone. When you've done enough time watching your internal landscape, you start to recognize and see things, even if you're not thinking, which is an interesting concept. When I first came across them in my own experience, I called them perceptual thoughts because they didn't cascade. They didn't go anywhere. They just recognized something, like recognizing the sound of a bell. You don't have to think to do that. You just recognize it. So as I was like hanging out, just watching my interior mind, I came across this activity that was like a lava landscape of volcanic lava that wasn't bubbling too much. It was just like percolating like this. And as I put my attention on it, I could actually hear the whispering of thought fragments. They weren't thinking. They were just like the dog leg or butter. I want to. They were just like thought fragments. And if I actually put attention on it and got interested, then it blossomed into full-fledged thinking, right? So it's interesting to sort of get to the point where you can watch the neuronal activity that would become thinking if you allowed it. But we've pulled our sense of self out of that, and so it's not getting our life energy to manifest into something. And so you keep watching that, and you keep watching what's going on inside, and it eventually pulls you back so that you're catching the perception of sensory constructs and hearing, and things start moving into a vibratory mode of perception. And you continue not getting identified with anything until you come to this, we'll just say this, something magical happens. And there's this like full-blown experiential realization that yourself is not what you thought it was. You've already got a lot of that because you're watching what you used to think you were, your thinking and your feelings and all of that other stuff. But there's this deep experiential realization that you are not the self that you thought you were. And once that's happened, there is like literally this freedom from a certain kind of suffering. You will never, ever get sucked in at a certain level for more than a few moments. And that's the caveat, right? That is often not said, that you truly understand that no matter what happens to you in this drama, it's just an arising and a passing away, and it's a phenomena, and it has nothing to do with your true underlying nature. So that's the enlightenment process.
And so that's waking up. This can take maybe other sort of journeys or trajectories to get there. Yeah, because you seem to describe a very slow, progressive development, but can it emerge somewhat spontaneously without meditative practices, or is there a particular quality that would differentiate an enlightenment waking up process to, sort of really culturally about the idea of waking up to certain things, like waking up to the fact that the social narrative you've been given as a way in the world is a lie, or waking up to the fact that elected governments are typically just figureheads for a shadow government that's controlling everything behind the scenes. Like, so maybe a good clarification on this waking up is what I'm looking at.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically you wake up to the lie that you've been trained into, that you always thought was you or your sense of self, because we perpetuate it culturally, and it seems to be a developmental necessity to go through. But just like we realize we're not our body, we get a really deep realization that we are not our ego structure, that we are not whatever it is we thought we were. We're not that. And so what are we? Well, that's the big question. Different traditions refer to it as like Buddha nature or Zen mind or vast open awareness, right? And what gets complicated is that there's, I think, different ways of approaching it or seeing it, and there's transpersonal components and personal components to how it's experienced, so that it gets confusing when you hear different traditions talk about what enlightenment is. They don't quite agree on it completely. But the underlying commonality seems to be that you've realized the true falsehood of the narrative of the self that you used to believe was you. You've really seen through that delusion, just like you've seen through the delusion that the government is here to help you, right? It's and when you've had that insight, something changes. Like you just can't take certain kinds of things as serious. Now, what's interesting in Buddhism is they have the four-path model, some traditions, and the 10 fetters. And so they get that even though you've had enlightenment, there's a kind of inertia. And I would say, this is my description, there's an inertia in your neuronal structures that still have the wrong habits. And it's going to take some time for those to unwind. And, you know, so once you've had that first enlightenment, you're kind of guaranteed, they say in 7 lifetimes, whatever that means, to hit an arhathood. And how I would translate that is that you're going to stop accumulating karma in a certain way, and you're just going to play out your karmas and learn the lessons that you need to become the wise being that the arhat is alleged to be. And I think that playing out process actually maps onto what we're now calling the 4 facets,
or the 4 pillars,
right?
Or the
the 4 pillars, or I refer to them as facets because I see them as just different angles on. It's kind of the same convergence, right? And we just go up different sides at different times.
So I have a question specifically, and this might be pointing to what you were saying about there's this general process that is about this, and then it looks differently when it's expressed in different cultures. There's the recognizing that the lie of yourself is not like the recognizing the lie of the self you thought you were.
Yes.
And then in that, there's a curiosity there about where the perceptions of something greater than even the self coming along. So something akin to what people might call God or spirit or universe or source or something. Where does and does generally that play into the waking up process?
Okay, so you're asking a really tough question, and it's been debated for hundreds of years. Like, where does God fit into this and things? And my best understanding of that is probably exemplified by kind of a bit of the gap between Hinduism and Buddhism, at least as it was taught in Buddha's day. So basically, the Buddha was a Hindu. And so in the Hindu system, they have the idea of the soul, or the Atman, little a Atman, and then they have God, kind of Brahman or Atman, capital A. And from that place, my little Atman is just a small piece of the big Atman. Now, Brahma, the creator, Shiva, the destroyer, all of that stuff, that's all in the Hindu narrative and metaphysics of how the world works. The Buddha apparently went past that. So you can think at one way to look at it is that even God is temporal. Even God exists within a certain subtle realm. And Buddhism would basically say there's a space beyond that you have to get to, the absolute truth, right? It's like beyond Brahman, beyond Atman, all of those things. So, and I think that gets a little contentious for the Hindu people, but that's, I think, the revelation that Buddha brought. He said, no, there's a stage of no suffering. There's a stage beyond even that. Even if you go to the celestial realms as a god for a while, you'll burn up your karma and eventually come down and have to get caught in this cycle of birth and rebirth again. And he says, I'm offering you a way out of even that. Right? And that's, for the people who've had that realization, there is a deathlessness and a birthlessness that seems to be relevant to them. And I think that's getting that's just getting into the real fringes, the edges of what is still being debated and understood in Buddhism. But that's my best take on it, that the Enlightenment process actually transcends even the concepts of gods and things like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, that was a great answer. It wasn't necessarily what I was pointing at, which was sort of the maybe for someone in the first time to recognize a higher power that exists beyond sort of like the general narrative of reality that would be present before an Enlightenment type experience. Although I could see how that would still kind of relate to some degree, because at some point in the Enlightenment process, you would come to a place where there's no dualistic divide between oneself and the higher power of reality. It's all simply one, I don't know, awareness happening, or awareness being or something.
Yeah. So what were you were asking more about gods and higher powers?
I was thinking less like gods, but I use God with the capital G reference to sort of an easily accessible sort of like linguistic direction towards the presence of a higher ordering force, or a higher organizing principle to reality than what might be conceivable generally from a state of baseline human consciousness, and the recognition of that, the role the recognition of that plays in the waking up process was my question.
Well, I actually believe that what you're referring to doesn't necessarily have to occur during the waking up process. That your contact with gods or higher beings is probably more of a fourth facet dance or exploration. That really the waking up process is going past all of the phenomena of the world and the manifest of the relative world, and the gods and the higher forces are included in that. So you don't necessarily have to pass through those stages as you're waking up. Some people do, and I think that's why it gets confusing when you hear about such different narratives and explanations of their enlightenment process, because I think particularly when you're in this no self space, you can potentially land as a self anywhere, including Brahma, or including, the principles that have been governing the evolution of our Earth for eons, right? You have access to transpersonal knowledges and experiences that are way beyond our human capacity, because you've left the human sphere, so to speak. But that's, I would say, a sidebar experience for some people. It's not actually part of the direct route of the enlightenment or the waking up process. It's more like gravy or dessert that you can have with that particular meal.
Okay, cool. And maybe that's something to unpack when we get to that fourth facet a little bit afterwards. So we have a situation, we'll say, where somebody has woken up. They have, their awareness have touched. I'm going to point to the work of another person. I don't know if you know him, Christopher Bache. Their awareness has become maybe the diamond luminosity or something. It has awakened to this full wokenness. It is #woke at this point, right? And so because of that, the old model of enlightenment was that's the apex experience. And once you have that, you have reached perfection or something. But yet then we have this long history of people kind of hitting that place, even helping others get to that place. But then they still rip people off and like are womanizers and alcoholics and, like powers, like abuses of power and stuff. So then that leads us into the necessity of the cleaning up and the growing up. So can you talk about now an understanding of what the cleaning up process is and how it relates to perhaps this inertia that you mentioned earlier that might come after the waking up process?
So after enlightenment, which is where these other processes really become relevant, because it's demythologizing the mythology of enlightenment. Like when you see people doing these kinds of things that you were just talking about. I phrase it as, why do enlightened people still do dumb things? And one way to think about it is after you're enlightened, you don't lose your accent, right? Like, I don't think I have an accent, but I do, right? From some other part of the world, they hear me as having an accent. I hear Australians as having an accent, and, you know, there's the New York accent. So when you're enlightened, your accent doesn't change. And that's a good metaphor for the idea that your cognitive structures that you've been using to relate to the world don't change. You still are, even though you know you're not this ego structure and this self, you're still using that ego structure and self to interact with the world. And it's not perfected. You're just not accumulating the karmas or the sanskaras that have been shaping your ego structure. It's on it's coming down, it's becoming more rarefied. You're going to just start losing structures and dysfunctions. You're not going to be gaining them anymore. And so one way of looking at these teachers who have done these outrageous things is that it might have just been the most cost-effective way to burn through their karma, you know, and get it out of their system, so that if you believe in rebirths, which is part of most of the Buddhist thing, their next life will be free of that particular distortion. So what I'm suggesting is that an explicit cleanup process may be a more effective way than burning it out through your life. And so
there's also a layer there about, like, you know, doing these terrible things, whatever they might be, these dumb things, as being a clean out for the next life, sort of like, I mean, there's a slippery slope of sort of excusing terrible behavior in the present life that might be available for reasonable reasonable assessment.
Well, and I would say we don't even have to talk about next life. We can just say that they looked after that issue. They played it out. They learned their lesson. They're not going to do that again.
Sure.
And so for the rest of their
lesson.
life. Well, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and that's where we start getting into the developmental structures as well. Why aren't they learning their lessons and the limitations? So, you know, what we've learned is that they're still playing their enlightenment out in an imperfect ego structure. And so they're going to make the same kinds of mistakes that normal people do. They just won't be identified with it in the same way, and hopefully they'll learn more quickly. So when you look at the cleaning up process, it's basically about our idiosyncratic conditioning that has made certain elements of our life more salient to us than other people. So do you have any particular fears or phobias or triggers, you know, that are unique to you that you don't mind sharing?
Well, I mean, given that I've been doing the work that you teach, I've discovered quite a few, some of which very deeply related to some very deep sobbing and wailing I've gone through. So I'm not entirely sure I want to talk too much about it, but one that has definitely come up over the course of my life was a need to prove my significance by feeling insignificant and needing to prove my significance by accomplishing something special.
Right. So that's a wonderful insight. And you can see now how your childhood experiences caused you to be playing out a certain kind of drama in your adult life that had this certain kind of pattern to it, which you just depicted very nicely, right? That you need to find some way of being special because of this underlying feeling of insignificance. Mm-hmm. And that, unfortunately, is how most of the ego is constructed. You know, we get these early childhood impressions that leave us feeling a certain way. And then because we don't process the feeling, it gets embedded in our system and we wrap our sense of self around it. And so then we end up creating what I call a feeling belief, which is like, I'm insignificant and no one will ever love me unless I'm special. You know, that might not be yours, but that could be a generalization that someone could make from that experience. Other feeling beliefs are like, I'm all alone in the world, and if I'm going to survive, I have to look after myself. So think of someone with that feeling belief going off into relationships, and what's going to happen? They're not going to bond. They're not going to actually depend on the other person. The other person's going to feel them as distant, and they're going to be playing out this not ever relying on anyone because it's too dangerous. And then that's going to end up messing up the relationship because the other person's looking for more intimacy. And so then they break up with that person and they think they learned their lesson, but they still have that deep feeling beliefs. And so they end up in another relationship and they still feel all alone in the world and that they can't ever count on anyone. So they don't do the bonding process. And so they just keep playing out the same dynamics with slight variations in all of their relationships.
And this is an unconscious process. Like I recognize the process I described to you, and because of that, I can see it when it emerges, and then care for it, relate with it in a responsible kind of way.
Yeah.
But you're talking about situations where this person has really no sense that that's what's happening. It's sort of an unconscious feeling carrying around, I am worthless, and also, or I am alone, and also I can't rely on anyone, and that informs the way their salience, that informs what they put attention to and how they interpret things, who they get involved with, and how they interpret the dynamics within that involvement. Does that sound about right?
Exactly. Yes. And most people don't become aware of these conditioning things until they've lived it out 4 or 5 or 6 times. So usually you start waking up to, oh, I've got a problem in your early 30s, because it's you've had the same experience. You go, why don't my friends have the same kind of relationships? How come they seem to be happy? Or why are, you start to see that you're bringing something unique to the relationship that's also causing the downfall. And everybody has these in different ways. Now, we're talking about really deep early ones, but any kind of conditioning from your past can be showing up. So if you've been in a motorcycle accident, you may be finding yourself highly reactive to being a passenger in a car, where you're not in control of the vehicle. So whether it's a motorcycle or a car accident, you'll have this conditioning that makes you fear cars as very dangerous, even though, most people don't get in accidents as you drive. So it's this, just our random conditioned history that makes certain aspects of our environment more salient to us. So for me, my dad was a traditional large man who had a big, loud voice, and he used anger and intimidation to keep us in line. So for me, I had a deep impression of fear for anyone who was taller than me and had a loud voice. So if I met somebody like that at a party, I immediately shrunk and felt submissive to that person, even though I had no history with that person. Because my conditioning just not randomly, associated big, loud people with overbearing and intimidating dynamics, which would make me withdraw. So that's the kind of cleaning up that we have to do in order to kind of bring equanimity to our life and not cause a lot of cognitive and emotional distortions in our interactions and our relationships.
So let me get clear on that, in case I missed it. So when you're talking about the early life stuff, we got these feeling beliefs that are established. Okay, we can hang on that feeling beliefs, and then you talk about the motorcycle accident, and at that point,
the car accident,
it becomes really illuminated to a person. It's like, oh, it sounds like you're talking about trauma.
Yes.
Right. And so the cleaning up process is a process of resolving the wound that has evolved into trauma, kind of leaning into a more Gabor Mate side of things. Trauma is the continuation of an adaptive mechanism that is now maladaptive and seated in the identity of the person. So the cleaning up process is the process of going in and resolving that trauma so that you're clearing the distortions that trauma is putting on your perception of yourself and the world.
Yeah. And the thing about this model is that not all impressions are traumatic, but all traumas have deep emotional impressions. So there are some emotional impressions that are still distorting our lens, but they're not necessarily traumatic. And so, and some of them are even, so like if you fell down the stairs once, you may just have a fear of stairs, and you're just very hesitant to go down them. I guess that's traumatic. Let's look at a positive thing. Let's suppose a kid was doted on and made to feel really significant and important all the time. As soon as they said anything, they were like praised and, oh, you're so wonderful, and blah 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 blah. And so they ended up with a feeling of high worth and high significance that's actually not congruent with their contributions to people or their skill level. And they go to school and they're stuck up and they feel superior to everybody, and people don't want to be their friends because they have this certain attitude. So it's not like it's traumatic, but it is a distortion, right? So we kind of have to just go through our history and the things that are causing problems, clear them out. And they can be both negative and positive, but most of the problems are the negative conditioning, the negative emotional kind of conditionings, but they can be either.
And this is what you've called accidental conditioned history, right?
Yes. Yeah. And technically the cleaning up is also to get rid of any cognitive distortions as well. Like if you think the world is flat, it's...
Or that birds aren't real.
Or that birds aren't real, or things like that. Yeah. So the general cleaning up thing is to try and bring your perception, particularly in the emotional world, into kind of equanimity, so that you don't overly weight some things more than others when you're interacting with them.
Mm-hmm. And so you have a specific practice that helps with the cleaning up process, Nadera. But before we go into that, I'd like to continue with the other two facets, and then sort of like go back into Nadera and then sort of like see how it all applies. So after the cleaning up process, we go into the growing up process. Can you explain that for us?
So yeah, going back to the growing up, we in general, we go through developmental stages. There's different models for what the stages are, like Robert Kegan's model. I like spiral dynamics. There's some other ones. But the basic notion is that we develop more cognitive complexity as we mature. But the maturation process, what we're calling a maturation process, isn't guaranteed. And it has to be stimulated by the environment. So you don't need to become any more complex than your environment or your culture is asking of you. And if you do, it can actually cause problems. So if we just go back to spiral dynamics, I grew up in a very traditional world, and it's literally about playing a role. Women basically were there to have children. Children were supposed to be quiet and respect their elders. A man's home is his castle. I mean, they literally gave us aphorisms to teach us what the role of everyone was. And as long as you played your role, everyone got along well. The trouble is there's not a lot of room for individuality in that, and so once traditional consciousness kind of established a civilization with extra resources, we got to actually expand and start developing individuality, so that the son of a blacksmith could maybe go off and learn how to ride horses or start his own business, because there were enough people around that someone else could do the blacksmithing besides the son of the blacksmith, right? So once that's established the civilization and the culture. It creates the conditions for the next developmental step, and that's the modern individuation. Who are you? What's your unique contributions? How am I different from other people? And it's really about an exploration of your own personal internal world. Who am I? What makes me different? Whereas that question is really problematic in the traditional world. Traditional consciousness. When my mother wanted to get a car, a license to drive a car, my dad got upset and said, "Why do you need to leave the house without me?" Mm-hmm. And well, she wanted to start being an individual. She didn't want to always be a mother looking after kids. But you see how it kind of causes problems if the rest of the culture is traditional, right? And we saw this with the birth of feminism and Black rights and all of this thing, where people are starting to say, no, my feelings, my needs matter. We move into modernism. We move into postmodernism. There's stages above that. And each stage is a little bit more complex. You can do everything that the previous stage could do, but you have more capacity. And in general, you move from an egocentric to an ethnocentric to a world-centric to a life-centric kind of place. In other words, your sense of self and what's important gets more and more expansive, and your connection of who's your group gets larger and larger and larger as well, to include more people.
I want to ask a question here, and I heard you, I think you answered this question on Daniel Thorson's Emerge podcast, which is excellent podcast, excellent interview. And I'm looking at, this evolution, this growing up of cultures, of civilization, and I could very much see like the move from the traditional to the what comes after traditional, modern. Is that right?
Modern. Yeah.
So you go from the role-based identity to the individualization. You go from sort of like traditional America to like the I generation, right? So to the iPod and the iMe and all the rest. And then you have this emergence into postmodern, which is that's where you're getting into more like a ethnocentric thinking. Is that right? Where you're kind of thinking more like
go ahead. Ethnocentric is, so there's a couple stages below traditional. I'm not starting at the beginning. There's survival, magical, power dominance, and then traditional. And in general, we all go through that as a being, but and we've gone through those as civilizations. But traditional kind of is where, if you look around our culture, there's still a lot of people living a very traditional mindset, and it's characterized by black and white thinking, us against them. It's the ethnocentric realm of existence. It's my group is superior to your group. That's where we get racism and things. Mm-hmm. I don't want you contaminating our genes. It's an ethnocentric way of seeing the world.
So this is what I'm pointing to then, because I'm thinking about the modern rise, as, again, referring back to the Emerge podcast, the modern rise towards social justice ideals and equality and all the rest in culture, in our civilization, which is excellent. That's good. Let's have that. And yet the people who are often the loudest at championing it are people who are very much acting in almost the exact opposite way that they're proposing to trying to create, with an us-them and violent response and shunning and cruelty and this sort of like, don't contaminate our ideological gene pool with your differences. Yeah. So can you talk about that for a second before we get back into the growing up individually?
Yeah, that's a complicated dynamic. So I'll have to explain postmodernism a little bit first, because what you're describing is what I call dysfunctional postmodernism. So once you move out of traditional thing, into modern individuation, it's actually extremely humbling a process. Anyone who's over 30 who hasn't made $1 million or become the star guitar player they've always wanted to be is usually humbled by life. It's not turned out the way they were hoping. by the time you're 30 or 35, there's a certain kind of humbling that goes on. You kind of know your place in the world, and you kind of know what your skill levels are to other people. You're not the Olympian, or you're not the best guitar player, but you're going to accept that that's who you are and make a good life. And that humbling process really sets us up nicely for the postmodern kind of disposition, which is to be really sensitive and accepting of other people and how they are in the world. And the other dynamic that happens is that you've expressed your individuality and it's lonely. You've left your group and you want to connect with other people like yourself. And so in my life, I connected with the Buddhist geeks and the integral community because I was into Buddhism and I was kind of geeky. I was liking technology. I was a computer programmer. So there was a whole group of people that I could relate to that were very different than my family that I'd grown up with. And so I really started, wanted to connect with those people. Now, when you meet people like yourself, so, do you have an experience where you individuated and then looked for people like yourself?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. I efforted quite hard to become my own person and like blaze a trail with my career and all the rest. And then it occurred to me that
Your interest in ethnogens?
Yeah, exactly. And then eventually, I mean, I have met many different colleagues and stuff around that time. But in regards to like the living my life day in, day out, the people I surround myself with, I realized at some point that none of what I was doing made any benefit whatsoever to anybody, like maybe on some larger scale, perhaps, but not in my personal life and not in the people I care most about if I wasn't involved in an active community of some variety. So I think I got to a point where I realized like how valuable and important it was for me to feel like I belong with people I care about and who care about me, and that we are collectively making efforts towards putting into these relationships in a way that those relationships will hold us for the duration of our lives, and also will be the sort of the net that new generations can step into, because a net of integrity and like good, healthy relating and all the rest. So, I mean, I definitely got to the place where I was like, yeah, all this awesome world traveling and like psychedelic taking and mind blowing and all the rest is all well and good, but now I feel incredibly alienated and isolated from other people because I'm not like in sync with others around me, but I don't want to jeopardize what I've accomplished to go into a group that I don't fit with. So then there was an effort towards like contributing and living with other people in a way that sort of we all are learning and co-creating and co-learning together into healthy belonging.
You sound like you've got a very conscious, like explicitly conscious group about group dynamics and support, which is really beautiful and rare. And I just want to ask, did you just randomly pick people off the street to join that little collective with you?
No, the circumstances of life put me into a series of choices, and as I followed what felt best for those choices, I ended up in a place that unexpectedly presented a group of people who had already been working towards a certain way of being in the world that I really connected with. Right. Yeah.
And so you resonated deeply with their values.
Yeah, that's a much simpler way of putting it. Yeah. But also well, as accurate.
That's really, yeah. And that's what it's about, is that you want to find people like you and connect deeply with them. And, the interesting thing is like, how do you connect deeply with somebody that you're meeting, right? Do you do it by studying a physics text or a computer book or talking philosophy? Or do you say, how do you feel about that? Right? If you want to get to know someone deeply, you say, how are you feeling? What do you think about that? What's your reaction to that? You're starting to explore the inner landscape of another person. And that's why feelings, which is what I'm talking about, like feelings and emotions, start becoming important only at a postmodern level of development. Prior to that, feelings and emotions get in the way of functioning. When you're in modern stages, they interfere with your ability to function, because if you're too sensitive to everything going around you, you'll get overwhelmed by feelings and you'll shut down. And if you're in a role, oriented traditional structure and you're having feelings, they get in the way of your role. So it's really only at postmodernism that feelings have a function, and they're needed for you to bond and get to know someone deeply. And that's where you start really connecting deeply with somebody else, and you form those deep communities. There was a context that we were doing this in.
You're moving towards explaining dysfunctional postmodernism in regards to the social justice warrior culture, which
Yes.
could point to also towards like the alt-right culture, but alt-right isn't pretending to be about social justice while seemingly operating in the opposite way.
Right. And so what I think happens is that we've got young kids, in my eyes, young, in their early 20s, going to university, who are really developmentally either at a kind of traditional or modern stage of development, but they're being given the rhetoric of postmodernism without really earning it. So they've got the values and the vision from a group of people that they haven't earned. They haven't been humbled by their modern individuality. And they still have this ethnocentric, us against them kind of leaning towards seeing the world. It's just the way their cognitive structures are. And so they take on the cause of postmodernism with an ethnocentric proselytation and kind of vehemence, which includes us against them kind of thinking. And so in that world, it's okay to attack the people who aren't like you.
Mm-hmm.
So I really see the dysfunctional social justice warrior as like people trying to step into a stage of development that they're not actually mature enough to be embodying yet. And you can see, if you look online, there are some social justice warriors who talk about their growing up story and how they see what they were doing was wrong and inappropriate, because they finally got there. They finally get that when you're actually at a functional modernism, you don't act like an ethnocentric gang trying to get rid of the other gang. You find ways to communicate and ways to live together. You don't want to stamp them out.
Those people might be at risk of being hashtag canceled, though, if they don't continue to agree with the younger Twitter generation. But yeah, I find that to be pretty interesting to think about. Here in Canada, a really great sort of case example would be the resistance to Jordan Peterson. And I don't agree with everything the guy says, and I can see how there's some excellent room for criticism about his ideals, and yet some of the responses were just brutal. And then recently, with his daughter coming out talking about how the medication he was prescribed, benzodiazepine, to deal with anxiety, when the anxiety around his wife's terminal cancer diagnosis became so intense, the doctors upped his dose. And as he continued to take it as prescribed, it had a paradoxical response where taking more caused anxiety and taking less caused withdrawal. He went through a series of issues, ends up in Russia trying to detox, with pneumonia, almost dying in the ICU for months. Finally is starting to recover. His daughter shares the story online, and all these so-called liberal, leftist, social justice people are like, good, he deserves it, fuck him. He deserves his addiction. He deserves his pain, And it's like, those are the people who are proposing to be leading the way for a better life for our whole civilization. And I think it's just...
And you can see the ethnocentric gang mentality of dominating and destroying the enemy. And unfortunately, it's hard to do anything about it, because that is how they see the world. that's literally their developmental and neuronal complexity is still too simplistic to catch the nuances of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's so difficult to talk across value structures, because the people in the higher levels have the neuronal complexity to deal with anything lower than them, but the people at lower levels cannot comprehend the perspective of the people at higher developmental levels.
So maybe this might be a point to weave back into sort of getting onto the looking around and then talking about the Nadera in the time that we have left, which is maybe just to close out this growing up process, give us a sort of like the quick blurb, like what is the growing up process and how do we grow up?
Okay, but just before I do that,
Yep.
I actually do want to say that with the postmodernism, I think that we've gone into this dysfunctional postmodernism and creating social justice warriors, partly because we didn't get the language to complete the postmodern phase. And that's what I think the bio-emotive framework has, is that you can't deal with your feelings and emotions and resolve them unless you know the difference between feelings and emotions and how they work. So we've got a whole bunch of people who are kind of cognitively at a postmodern phase, but they don't have the tools to actually complete the process. And that's why emotional intelligence came into being 20 or 30 years ago, but it doesn't have the resolution that, say, the bio-emotive framework has to give you the tools to complete the postmodern sensitivity and resolve your issues and things, right? So that though I think if the social justice warriors actually were given the tools to deal with their feelings and emotions in a functional way, they would grow up much more quickly than they're going to just by the happenstance of life. So I just wanted to say that. I think our culture because the leading edge of our culture is mostly postmodernism. And until an explicit language for feelings and emotions are embraced, we won't be able to complete that stage and move on. Okay? Mm-hmm. So the basics, just stepping back, the basic growing up sequence is that you start from relatively simple neuronal complexity. As you get challenged and stimulated by your environment and interaction with it, you develop more and more neuronal complexity so that you can see and understand and embrace more and more of the world without reacting and pushing it away. There's more of an embrace as you go higher. Once you get into second tier stages, you're moving into a post-rational stage. So both modern and postmodern are very rational. Modern is really identified with thinking. Postmodern is about thinking. And then second tier in my model is more about post-rational creativity, where you're starting to think and see the world in pattern recognition. And it's, in my language, your emotional and intellectual brains are starting to work together. And you're going to create what I would call this sort of wisdom phase in the second stage of, the second tier. And the first part of wisdom is an individual deconstruction of your own ego. And that's the process that we were talking about, like seeing your patterns in history and the significance and, special. That's a deconstruction phase. The second one is where you have to put a vision together that makes sense of everything you've learned, including the constructed nature of your ego, into the bigger picture of big history and life and all of that, and where our culture is and climate change. And so it's harder to do those second stages because we don't have a lot of role models, right? It's it's new grooves in the noosphere, to talk in integral language. And then that second tier, you move past that into third tier, which is where developmentally your sense of self and how you see the world is very, very expansive. And you really experientially understand that you're not most of the cognitive processes that have been going on. It's similar to the disidentification process, except that can be done with as states of consciousness. And now you're getting there through stages of development. But you're converging on the same place, where at a certain point you realize that you're really, there is no self per se, that those are just tools for interacting with the world. And you can kind of put on different senses of self to talk to different people, different ego structures. So you can talk to people in traditional, you can talk to people at postmodern, you can talk to second tier people, and you just see them as different ways of relating to people, that you move into their level of complexity and connect in with them. And so because you now see all of these different stages as tools, there's very little that you're identified with developmentally other than being a point in space-time.
So then that kind of like ties back into the waking up.
Yes. And that's why they're both converging into a similar space, except one through state, one through stage. And in either place, the Buddhists talk about the mind as having six senses, or the mind being the sixth sense. Because when you get to that place where a thought and your ego construction is no different than a sound, right? It's just a neural configuration and orientation that helps you interact with the world better. And you know you're not the sound, and you know you're not your ego, and you know you're not those thought processes. So all of that stuff is just like another sense that you're using to orient and relate to the world through. And that would be called, Wilber talks about that as witness consciousness. I refer to it as more as just being identified as being a point in space-time, right? And that's the third tier.
So out of like jumping back a little bit from the integral model, one of the things that you brought up, and this will be sort of like to resolve out into looking around before we talk about Nadera, running pretty low on time here, is this idea, how did you say it, that the growing up process is a process that happens where, and I'm going to use my own language, try to blend in with yours, that my sense of self, how I contextualize my sense of self and how I orient and navigate the world increases in complexity as I continue to show up to the world and I continue to grind up against the world and face challenges and grow and adapt over time, basically learning a greater capacity to show up to complex situations without reacting from distorted or young states of mind, which I might say like the growing up process is a process of learning how to increasingly adult in increasingly complex situations.
Yes.
Great. So then what is looking around? What's that all about?
And this is where we diverge a little bit, right? And I'll tell you after I explain looking around. So what I'm basically saying is what you see in the world is going to determine kind of the world that you make up, that you're living in. So let's suppose you as a person are completely oblivious to the emotional world. Can you imagine the kind of problems that would give you with your girlfriend or your friends if you were just like so intellectual that all of that stuff, like Sheldon on the Big Bang Theory?
Oh, it's crazy. It would always just be like problem solving and intellectualization and never really being present with each other or supporting each other in feelings, or having an ongoing incapacity to differentiate between like feelings that are arising due to leftover wounds from the past and feelings that are arising in the context of an actual sort of like issue and behavior that's present to the relationship. Maybe
if you're even aware that you're having feelings, you just know you have to go to the bathroom.
Right. or I don't want to talk
feel
about
like
this right
throwing
now.
up.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's room here where you really have to look at the other three facets and go, there's a space here where you can't do any of this other work if you're not sensitive to that dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at, so I use the example of emotional stuff. I think one of our friends on Twitter talked about being oblivious to flirting, right? And that causes problems. So if you're not picking up what's going on around you, you can't process it and interact with it. So you have to develop sensitivity to all the different dimensions that humans are capable of interacting with. And I gave two mundane examples, but it also goes into more of the spiritual realm. So can you pick up, so let's say some people are sensitive to ghosts and spirits or to plant energies. They're going to experience a different world than someone who doesn't experience plants and plant energies, right? So this fourth facet is really about getting to know or exploring all the different potential realms of the cosmos with a K. And we can see that the shamans are really good at that, and they move into transpersonal realms, and they have relationships with beings that most material reductionists think don't exist, but yet there's knowledge that seems to be transmitted from those realms that, end up teaching them how to use plants for different medicines. So there is something about their sensitivity that's creating a different world than what other people live in. And the shamanistic world explores that. The Buddhist world explores it to a lesser extent, or at least they don't emphasize it as much. But even just, can you stay awake in your dreams?
Mm.
If you can't, then you're oblivious to 6 or 8 hours of your life every day, right? Some people are aware of their dreams, and so they're living in a different world. You can do lucid dreaming. You start getting a different relationship. Can you stay awake during deep sleep, which is something that the dream yogas teach you? So there's this whole realm and emphasis that part of our journey as humans is to start waking up or being sensitive to all these different realms of existence that it's possible to connect with. The dream yogas are doing it. The shamanistic traditions are doing it. And if you're not sensitive to the realms, they're going to be influencing you and your life without you being aware of it. And so this brings us to the final piece that I actually didn't share in Toronto, but I think is relevant. And I think it's probably, I don't know if we can get too much into Nadura and have covered all of this stuff, because Nadura in itself is its own little, usually hour talk.
It's so interesting because in the last episode too, we ran out of time and you're like, yeah, the Nadura, and then you just gave this quick. So.
Well, and it's and I thought about it when you asked, and I said, man, the 4 facets and Nadura, I don't know, but we'll see. But I think this part is actually really important.
Yeah, go
because it actually validates why I think the looking around component is more valid than the showing up component. And basically, if we look at these 4 facets, I had this insight that I actually resisted for a while, and then I spent time with it, and I realized that the 4 facets of transformation actually mapped onto the 4 quadrants that Wilber talks about. And it took a little bit of a mind bend to get it, but now that I've bent my mind, it fits really well. So we'll see if it fits when I tell you. So, and I think I shared this in Toronto, but not the next piece. So if you look at the 4 facets, are the interior and the exterior, or the interior and the exterior of the individual and the collective. So if we look at the interior of the individual, that's their experience of who they are. That's where the waking up process is. That's where the disidentification process is. It's the individual and their experience of who they are. If you look at the cleaning up process, it's the interior of the collective. It's like my experience of my family and my group growing up caused me to have a certain sensitivity to certain types of people and feelings and dynamics. I got conditioned for my early culture, and it works in that culture, but it doesn't work when I leave that culture. So I have to clean up my early conditioning if I want to have functional relationships as an adult. It made for functional, quote, functional relationships as a kid. I adapted, but it's distorting my views of reality as an adult. So I have to clean up my early conditioning. So that maps onto my cultural conditioning. The growing up stage is actually the exterior of the individual. And it's like literally the emphasis is on me developing the cognitive neuronal complexity to see with a high enough conceptual resolution what's going on around me, particularly, you know, and this is where the match has to kind of fit the people you're with. If you're a traditional person hanging out with postmoderns, it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And if you're a postmodern person hanging out with traditional people, it doesn't work. So you kind of have to develop the neuronal complexity to live in the world that you're living with. They kind of have to map on. And if you don't, you're a bit of a misfit. But it's literally a neuronal development that allows you to embrace more and more complexity. You need more neuronal complexity to think in grays than you do in black and whites. Right? And so you really only get that neuronal complexity by being stimulated in your environment or by doing the contemplations that come with a lot of meditative practices. It's those contemplations that stimulate that neuronal complexity that you can see the world differently, effortlessly. And then the fourth one, the looking around, is the exterior of the collective. It's like literally your environment. If you're not sensitive to your environment, you're going to have influences on you that you're not aware of. And so the job of that fourth facet, the looking around, is to develop the perceptual sensitivity to be aware of everything that's going on in your environment. And it's an exploration of that fourth factor. So you can see how the four facets kind of map on nicely to the four quadrants. And that the looking around for your environment, which is what Integral calls it, the external of the collective, is about being sensitive to it. And now the final phase is that this is actually a map. So Wilber says that the self is tetra arising, which means it arises in all four quadrants. You can't separate one quadrant out from the others. And so what's going on is that whatever I can perceive is being processed by my developmental complexity, is being weighted by my conditioned history, which creates the world, reality, and then I have to draw a line from that world that I've created into what's myself and what's the world. And when I'm young and new at it, I draw the line too big and I suffer too much. Like I'm too much of what I've created is me, right? And the process of disidentifying is to realizing, oh, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me. And I'm drawing the line differently. But it's all happening. The self and the world are being co-created. And where I draw the line decides on what is me and what is the world. So if from earlier examples, I'm aware of my emotional realm, and I interpret it as a traditional, from developmental stage, and I see that person's disagreement with me as a fundamental disagreement with my values of the world, and my experience of that is that I'm going to be dominated or, told that I'm wrong or bad, then I'm going to start fighting and get angry to prove to them that my view is right. And if I am my anger, then I'm just going to rage at them. If I, because I've identified with that arising. But if I'm not my anger, I can call it angry. I can say, listen, I'm really angry with you. I don't want to talk to you anymore. And that's just a different way of dealing with the anger. I've named it instead of being in it. But at the same time, if someone who's challenged my views of the world and I'm postmodern, I don't take it as the kind of threat. It's not black and white. I may or may not have conditioning about whether that's going to destroy me or not because they disagree with me. But I can developmentally say, listen, I don't agree with how you're seeing the world and you're kind of triggering me a little bit. But I guess we'll just have to learn to live together, right? Because I can say you're triggering me because I'm not identified with that arising.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see how the self is happening. It's being co-created through all four facets, that they have that place. And if I happen to be someone who's sensitive to spirits, then it's going to be processed through my developmental lens. And so here's an example that will make some of this make sense. I worked with somebody who had been doing ayahuasca journeys, and they had an interesting pattern where every time they did ayahuasca, they ended up going into the spirit world and joining a battle that was going on between good and evil. And they were always fighting for the side of good against evil. And it was a kind of exhausting thing because they were really pushing for it and identified with it. And they almost didn't want to keep doing ayahuasca because it was so repetitive. And so I said, well, let's look at this from your conditioned history and see if there's any reasons why you're going to that realm all the time. And as we talked about the symbols, and I asked him about what was going on in the journey, he started talking about, oh, yeah, you're right. I remember watching my dad yell at my mom, and she was on the floor crying, and I was hiding behind the couch, and I felt so helpless, and I couldn't do anything about it. And then he's like, oh my God, I'm just playing that out over and over. It's, the wound happened young, and it was like dad was evil, mom was good, I'm feeling helpless. And so he was in ayahuasca trying to resolve that situation by going to good against evil, fighting for the right of good, being exhausted, feeling helpless, not getting anywhere with it. And so that was the world that he was living in ayahuasca, because of that sensitivity that he had from conditioning. And once we talked about that, and he expressed it and he cried about it, he did ayahuasca again. And for the first time in probably 5 or more ceremonies, he didn't go to that realm. He didn't live through that process again. He cleared it from his system. And so now he got to experience different realms. He wasn't stuck in that particular dynamic.
Interesting. So we obviously don't have time to talk about Nadera today. Possibly we could be so lucky to have you on the show a third time to talk specifically about Nadera, and eventually the listeners will know what this is.
And if you don't say something else before Nadera, we'll maybe actually talk about it.
Yeah, sure. But yeah, so maybe I'm not sure I fully understood what that final piece was. You had talked about the 4 quadrants, which is like internal, personal, internal,
interior and the exterior of the individual and the collective. So this assumes integral, and if you don't, you'll take some time to think about that. And
that maps onto the four facets. And that the final piece that you hadn't shared in Toronto was that there's an ongoing co-creation of the self and the world that's determined by where the line is drawn between self and the world. That more and more is not the self the further along this development you go.
Right. Now that's a little bit nuanced for the point I'm trying to make there. The essence of the point is that the ego, the world that you're living in are being created by your kind of place in each of these 4 facets. What you're sensitive to is going to be processed by your developmental stage. It's going to be distorted a little bit by your conditioned history, and different things will be emphasized. And that's creating reality. And then you divide that into me. You divide reality into me and the rest of the world by that disidentification process. If you don't do any division, then you're in a non-dual state. And that's a rare high spiritual attainment. But most people do a division. But they're still going to be living in the world that's being created by their developmental stage and their conditioned history and their perceptual sensitivity. So literally, a witch who's sensitive to energies, or a warlock or a mystic who's sensitive to energies and psychic phenomena, is going to start off creating the world differently than someone who isn't sensitive to those things. But it will still be passed through their developmental stage. And so a developmental, traditional, or say a power dominance, if you're developmentally at a power dominant stage, and you've got connection to, astral entities, you're going to see who you can use to vanquish your enemies with them. It's going to be processed by your developmental stage. Whereas if you're in postmodern, you're going to go, wow, that's an interesting realm of existence. I don't want to spend much time there, right? You'll see it very differently. And then if you've been burnt doing astral projection when you were young and you come across entities, you have a fear response to them, so you can't even be impartial, right? And you're identified with it. So it's all those four facets are creating reality and your sense of self and the world. And everyone's got different stages or different places in each of those four facets. So we're all living in slightly different worlds. And
we're
it's
all
a miracle we could
clashing / merging with each other all the time, trying to make sense of this thing.
Well, and see, the nice thing about it is it's through our relationships and the grinding against other people's perceptions that allow us to be aware of the distortions and the developmental limitations that we have, so that we can wake up to them and start going, oh, right, he's not actually putting me down. I'm hypersensitive to being criticized because of my feeling of, insignificance or worthlessness or whatever. So it's the grinding when he says, no, I'm not putting you down. I have to integrate that. And then I can grow and learn and clean things from it, right? So it's a miracle we talk to each other, and it's the fact that we bump up against each other that's another miracle that allows us to grow and expand in our own, development.
Yeah, excellent. So we're done. We're at time. And also I want to wet the whistle of the listeners a little bit here, with a very sort of like a very, very top level, almost like back of the book blurb, right? Of what the Nadera process is and how essential it is to the cleaning up process and the clearing of distortions. Now, not to explain the whole thing because it's long, right? Yeah. But just enough to really get that extra interest present for the listeners to follow the rest of your work afterwards.
Okay, so the back of the book thing, or a summary of it, is most people think their way through problems. Nadera is a process of feeling your way through a problem. And it uses the resonance or the emotional activation that you feel in your body to guide your exploration as you're looking for the right words that fit the feelings that have been triggered by whatever you're upset about out there. So it's a way of, I think Nadera is something that everyone did naturally as a child, right? But they didn't get the explicit words that I discovered, like interpersonal feelings cause core feelings, which cause emotions. That's really important. You need to do Nadera for all three of those levels, but you're using the feedback and the resonance of your emotional system as it manifests in your body to guide your selection of the words so that you can get deeply into the words that are actually triggered in your emotional system. And that gives you the experience of like seeing your traumas and having insights about why you've been acting the way you have and clearing them out of your system at the same time when you complete the crying process.
Right. Which from the outside looks like somebody generally crying and saying exactly what they're feeling.
Yes.
Yeah. And go ahead.
And I'll just say, like, if you cry, that's wonderful. You're getting rid of the physiological chemicals and things that are building up from stress and anxiety and everything that we call that. But to heal, you need to cry and express the feelings. If you just cry without the feelings, you won't heal. It won't resolve. If you just have the feelings, but you don't cry or at least have autonomic activation while you're saying them, you won't heal. You need both the crying and the words to heal. And that's the part that I say is missing from the postmodern stage. To really complete that, you need the words as well as the sensitivity.
Mm-hmm. And it's also something that, having now explicitly been practicing it since your workshop, has been profound on its impact in myself, in the larger community I'm a part of, that we're all like, you know, at your workshop and in my partnership. And also, as I had commented to you, it leans really, it overlaps extremely well into the healing that can come out of a psychedelic experience, and explicitly my work with psilocybin mushrooms. But all of that will have to be left for another podcast at some point, hopefully in the future. Maybe to just finish us off, you could give us your all the relevant social media, website, where people can find out more about what you do.
Yeah. So my website is called bio-emotiveframework.com. And I've got a series of products, like the video series and a self-paced course that you can do if you just want to get the education. The self-paced course will give you some experiential taste of it. You kind of need to get the Naduro guidebook to go with that. It's a small e-booklet manual. I'm also offering online courses right now where I've got people meeting every Thursday at 2 Central Time. And every second week, I'm teaching Nadura experientially. I have a Q&A one of the weeks, and I have a masterclass where I teach these kinds of interesting ideas on another week. And so you can sort of subscribe to that and just show up every Thursday as it fits your schedule. And I do one-on-one coaching as well. And my daughter, Allie, is teaching circling with Nadura in it and multi-level communication. So there's a number of different options there for people to get involved if they want to learn more. But there's a lot of good free material on my website where you can get processing forms for the core feelings and interpersonal feelings. It's under free. And I've got some nice videos, and your podcast will be up there again too, awesome, under my video series. So I'm trying to make it so that people can learn a lot just from the free material. And if it resonates, you can start purchasing stuff and getting more involved and go on this journey and down that little rabbit hole of transformation.
For sure. And that's all at bio-emotive.com.
Yeah. And I've got a little bit of a presence on Twitter, but it's not a main venue right now. I'm still exploring that. If you get on my email list, if you sign up, there's a really nice sequence of introductory material to the stuff. And I'm about to start. Actually, I'm really excited. I'm going to be sending out my definitions of the different feelings, the 18 core feelings, positive and negative versions. And it's been really interesting to do that and come up with little tidbits and things. And a lot of people find that reading the definition really wakes up their emotional system, that resonates more than they just hear the word, because the emotional system hasn't been conditioned to know that word is what they're feeling.
Oh, I had a conversation with a friend of mine. I was telling her about what I learned, and she was like, well, what's the difference between worthless and insignificant? And I was like, I think we just found a place where you are either underdeveloped or wounded. So
yeah,
but we'll close it here.
I'm really glad that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I just want to say I'm really glad that you're resonating with this work and you're taking it into your life personally, and it's being that useful to you. I'm excited when that happens, and that your community, and that you've got a community who are supporting you in it.
Yeah, thanks, Douglas. I also am really appreciating it. So it's a great little positive feedback loop that we're in right now. So Dr. Douglas Tataryn, thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thank you, James. It was been wonderful. We'll see you again.
And cut.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm glad you enjoyed this episode. I assume you enjoyed it if you stayed in all the way to the end, and I also assume you'll get quite a bit of value out of exploring what Dr. Tataryn offered us in this episode. His Nadera process we didn't talk about. I talked about it with him a little bit afterwards, just like his thoughts on whether or not he would come in, and we both sort of decided that, you know, it made sense maybe to talk about it to some degree, but it's like there's really no substitute for experiencing it directly in a direct learning situation. So if you ever get a chance, if COVID ever goes away, you know, consider heading up to one of Dr. Tataryn's workshops. But either way, check out his online content. Links to all of that is going to be in the description. So please follow up with Dr. Tataryn's work. He's excellent. He's got excellent stuff to offer, and he's a really nice, easy to get along with guy. So that always helps. That's it. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't already and you would like to become a patron on Patreon, jameswjesso.com/support has options to support on Patreon, as well as to leave a one-time PayPal donation or buy something from the shop. Basically, anything is something. So please consider contributing financially in some way or another if you've got the means. Now, for those of you who are still tuned in on YouTube, we're going to switcheroo here, and I will show you my garden, which does not look very happy and exciting right now. But this is my garden. It's my yard is messy. You can see I haven't really done much to take care of it. And you can also see my exercise protocols there. But this is my garden. It's coming along. It's my housemate's plants, and dealing with pests, dealing with improper soil conditions, and my chard just dying, and yeah, just figuring out for my first time ever and feeling really good about it. So cool, growing plants. Again, thank you for tuning in. Like and subscribe on YouTube if you've made it this far and you're digging the channel, and see you on the next episode. Take care.